Hi, Roland Yap, NUS. So in the example you gave, right, like in C you were having CFI, and then in Rust you were having the normal Rust memory safety. So this would be an example of incompatible defenses in action, right? But what if you had memory safety on the C side, and of course memory safety on the Rust side? So this would be, maybe compatible assumptions to some extent. Did you investigate that?
Yes, thank you for your question. That's a good point. I think what we want to try to show in our work is that as long as you have threat models that are compatible, then you're actually doing incremental deployment correctly. So you can have situations where maybe you're deploying something like secured on the C side as well as Rust, so there's sort of this full memory safety of your whole program. Or you could do it the flip side where maybe you deploy control flow CFI on the Rust code, things like that, so that you're actually consistent across the way. So we're really trying to encourage this notion of trying to graphically model your threat models so that you can see that your defenses are actually in line between the two languages.
Zephyr Yao from UC Irvine. This is a very inspiring talk. Thank you. Just want to brainstorm, is there any defense mechanism? And what I have in my mind is that can we partition for example, in process, partition this safe language and unsafe language, for example, using MPK?
Thank you. That's another excellent point. In my opinion, I would agree with you that is a strong path forward for a defense. So we really want to isolate the languages and prevent those unintended interactions that I discussed earlier. The intended interactions go through the actual function call, but if we can isolate the languages and prevent all of the other unintended interactions, we're sort of narrowing the scope that we have to focus on. So that's a good path forward.
Thank you.
Excellent talk. Thanks very much. Wes Hardiker, USC ISI. So would you say that one of your languages, or one of your takeaways might be we should build more and more languages with completely self-isolating modules that are in their own language, right? I mean, that's one of the other ways that you could promote safety, and there's always speed detriments with that, right? The Python-only versions of a Python module are much slower than the C versions and things like that. And I have to, just one final comment, I don't envy your looking through the Firefox code. I've worked through it, and you end up with 50 switches between C++ and JavaScript back and forth over 60 stack layers. It's pretty painful.
Yes, thank you for your comment and question. I think you're right that if we can have better isolation mechanisms built into the language, that is definitely, if we can have that automatically, that's great. I would say, unfortunately, though, this giant sets of code bases of legacy C, C++ code isn't going to go away, and we really want to tackle how do we get safe languages into that. So even if Rust has language isolation mechanisms associated with it, there's still going to be these undercurrents of unintended interactions just because C can do whatever it wants with the heap or on the stack. So if we are able to properly isolate all of them in the language, that would be excellent because that would be very performant, but yeah.
So you mentioned the large number of primitives, CLA primitives that you found. Were you able to combine any of them into exploitable vulnerabilities?
So we didn't do that specifically on Firefox. I think one of the things that's good about Firefox is that it does deploy some defenses already. So we have primitives showing that these things are possible, but they do have work like RLBox that we want to take into account in the future and see if these go around some of those defenses.
Okay. And then another question, it seems that the degradation happens when you combine, like C with CFI and Rust. But if you take C without CFI, doesn't seem like you don't get the degradation. You don't necessarily get much of the win, but you don't get the degradation either. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do as an attacker. Are you trying to corrupt the CFI mechanisms in C? Then you don't have to if the CFI is not deployed. But if you're trying to corrupt the safety guarantees of Rust with the C code, then whether or not CFI deployed doesn't stop you.
So I guess where I was going with this is, so if you're starting with a legacy, hypothetically, a legacy code base in C, C++, and you have a choice, do you add CFI or do you start switching to Rust? What would you recommend? Because obviously doing both is going to be bad, so if you had to pick one.
Well, I would deploy CFI just because then you're sort of limiting some of the attacks. You're not maybe solving all of the cross-language attacks, but you're at least getting at some of the traditional ones. But I'd also just note that a lot of these legacy code bases are already compiled, that you don't necessarily have the option to choose whether you're going to do CFI or not. Like, it might already just be baked into the binary blob that you're working with.
All right, so you heard it, right? C with CFI is better than Rust. It's science.